Thanks for the introduction. It's nice to be here again. I got off the plane from Singapore a couple of days ago, so I'm still suffering from jet lag. I remember many years back, I actually had I was between my master's and my PhD. I took some time to go to Europe, and I was traveling there. And I was in Grion, Switzerland, waiting for a bus to go up the ski slopes. And I was trying to make small talk with one of the guys sitting there waiting to go on the bus. The first question I asked him was, what do you do? And his response was, you must be American. And I said, why is that? He says, well, that's a very American question to ask, what do you do? And it's not until actually like the last couple of days that I'm starting to appreciate it, because the hardest question people have been asking me lately is, what do you do? And I actually don't really have an answer for that these days. I'm sort of in between in this sort of like netherworld. I mean, after sort of doing several venture-backed startups, I've come to realize that like when you're in a startup, you actually don't do a lot of making. It starts with an idea and a lot of making, but then you sort of have to run the business and things get all taken up. And I really wanted to get back to making, so I'm trying to spend some time getting back to making. The other thing I sort of realized is that actually like there's a lot to learn in the world of making, right? Like you go to China and you see these people who are building cell phones in like 3 months and selling them for like $10, right? And there's a lot of stuff out there that I don't know and I'd like to learn and understand. So I've been sort of doing a lot of little projects that are sort of angled at sort of developing new capabilities, understanding new things. And one of the challenges is like, how do I make at these sort of scales of like 1 to 1,000? Like my volume is way lower now that I'm not working for a startup and not doing consumer electronics. So how do we make things at these really small volumes? And part of that comes down to sort of picking really good partners and developing a network of people in the manufacturing world who can help you with these sorts of things. It's a kind of a common notion that you can't go to China if you want to build one. But actually, in some of Zach's slides earlier, about Hackcelerator, China's actually a great place to build exactly one, but you just kind of have to be there, right? You don't go hop on a plane and fly to China to make one thing. That completely doesn't make any sense at all, right? But when you're out in Asia and you're in that ecosystem and you're surrounded by people with excess CNC capacity and people have just tons of things that when I say like the difference, one of the things that's happened over the kind of a few years is that as consumers out here who buy from retailers, we get used to walking into Best Buy and being like, well, I can only get USB cables that are 1 meter or 2 meters in length. If I want 2.3 meter long USB cable, you just can't get it. Best Buy has 10,000 2-meter USB cables. They want to sell you that. But if you go to a factory in China, they just have wire and they have like bits of ends. And if you want a 2.3 meter cable, they just sort of like twist some knobs in the machine and you get a 2.3 meter cable out. And if you know the guy, he'll run the machine and just make one for you. And that's completely fine. And that's great. So I'm going to give a talk today about sort of partnering to get stuff made. Actually, Scott from Dragon gave a lot of my talk. I was looking at slides like, oh my God, it's exactly what I'll talk about later today. But I'll try. I'm going to try and put a bit of a more angle on it about like how the partnering is important and how it can actually help you as not just trying to create a company or sell something, but as just makers. How can you access these ecosystems, get stuff made? So there's a kind of a concept that people have about the way things work and the way the world is, and a very sort of, I would say, like a Western idea of how IP and ideas and things flow is that you have, a kind of a central person, a central idea. You get a patent, you get a copyright. There's a compulsory license. You broadcast to the world, and money comes back to you, right? And that kind of idea works really well if you're doing software, because really you can do it on your own. You can just make your website, you go to AWS, you buy a service, and you're pushing software to the world. It's from one point to everyone else. When you're in hardware, you really don't just make it by yourself. Anyone who tries to make 10,000 something on their own in their garage or their living room rapidly realize that's a really bad idea. We hear that story all the time, like, my God, I need to find partners to get stuff built. So a lot of, in the reality, the maker is a small part of an ecosystem. They're an important part, but you need to create a network, and you have to create a group of people, and you have to find partners to really get your stuff made. And that is part of the big difference between building software and building hardware, is that there's a lot of flesh and blood that goes behind building anything. Even if you highly automate the process, there's a lot of people behind it. So, there's sort of an attitude I hear from some people like, I'm going to pick a factory, and they treat it as I'm going to pick a vendor, right? Like, I'm going to tell someone how they're going to make my stuff, right? And this sets up the whole scenario for the maker-factory relationship to almost be adversarial or sort of master-slave style. Like, I am going to tell those guys, and we're going to control the quality, and they're not going to screw up my idea. And I feel like that's, like, approaching partners with that sort of attitude is unhealthy at best. Really, I think, what people should sort of move to a paradigm of, you should be in the factory and the factory is in you. You two sort of merge together and become one, and you work together to get something done. Because once you've actually sort of engaged and got your product, it is kind of like a marriage. Like, you have a ton of money tied up inside the factory has a ton of money tied up inside of you. You have aligned fates, and it really helps to sort of have the right attitude in working with the factory and promoting the progress of your product. And I was like noticing everyone's slides are so beautiful these days. Like, I don't know what people are using for their stuff, but I'm like still using like LibreOffice or something like that, and pulling clip art off of like open clip art, and everyone has these awesome looking slides, and this is the best I can do. So I like to say when you're picking a partner, it's a lot like that scene from Harry Potter where they're trying to match wands with wizards. And the guy says that the wand picks the wizard as much as the wizard picks the wand. And this is very true with factories. Factories have different personalities and different cultures based upon the people who run them and own them. You can get into stereotypes and that sort of stuff. Like, there's sort of, you talk to some people and say, the Hong Kong guys are traders. They're just in there for the money. They're not really in the factory all the day. They go across the border from Shenzhen to Hong Kong at night. They don't live with the workers, and so they're not as engaged in the factories. The Taiwanese guys, they come over. They live there in the factory. They're with the workers, but they're very like hierarchical. The Chinese guys are very, in the dirt with you, and they're rolling around, but they're sort of a little unsophisticated. Whatever it is, right? But they all have a kind of a different style based upon the management and the culture that goes into the factory. And this has to really match like what you're looking to do and what you're trying to do in your product. And so when people ask me, hey Bunnie, I need a factory to work with, I'm like, well, I have people that I really like working with. I can recommend that you talk to them, but you should really get out there and try to find someone who's a good match for you. My good partners may not be your good partners per se. I mean, I think they generally will be a good match, but everyone's different. There's a few considerations that I have if you're going to go out and look for a partner to help you make stuff. One thing that I like to use is that it's easy to know the cost, but hard to know the price. I actually stole this from Liam Casey. He told me this very early on when I was first trying to do stuff with Chumby, and it really rings true with me. I've seen so many times, people go into factories and they have just priced the last micro penny out of, like you really actually get into like millicents and micro pennies on some of these parts, like resistors and stuff, and they will like just argue with the factories over these kinds of things, and they don't realize that in that whole process of arguing over these little details, they're really setting up a caustic environment, right? The factory gets upset at you, and they feel like they worry that you're going to like shaft them, leave them with bills unpaid, whatever it is, and they start getting defensive, and the relationship starts to suffer. And so, while it's easy to go ahead and hammer on the costs and really work with the factory, take a step back and look at, are you developing a partnership with people who can help solve problems with you in the long term? That can be worth more than the absolute cost on its own. Another thing that I like to say is that if you can't meet with the boss, you're nobody. I've been to Foxconn, I've been to Huawei, I've been to all these huge factories, right? And I'm always greeted by some low-level salesperson who's very polite and nice and takes me on the tour, and I get to see all kinds of cool equipment, and that's great. But I know that if I wanted to put something in that factory and I was having a problem, there is no way they're going to stop the line for me because there's Apple stuff running over there, and Microsoft running over there, and Dell over there, and HP over there, and it's not going to make financial sense for them to do anything for me. Whereas if I walk in the factory and we have a tour or something, and the big boss, the Laoban, the CEO, comes down and says hi to me, and then later on we sit around and we're drinking tea with each other and talking about the product. He's getting really excited about the opportunity. Later on, if I have a problem, I know I can go to the Laoban's office, the big boss's office, and be like, hey, I know it's an imposition, but can you stop that line for me and actually get my tool in there real quick so I can get a couple presses off so I can check this and keep things moving. And I've had factories go and keep people on night shifts for me to complete tooling on time. I have pushed other tools off the line. I mean, there's just amazing things you can do when the boss really believes in your product. He will really turn the whole factory around and make it work for you, and things and just magic happen. Another thing is that light is the best disinfectant. If you can't have an open and sort of honest discussion about cost with the people, then the relationship is not going to go well. I definitely insist on having a fully costed bill of materials where they sort of say, here's the cost of all the resistors and all the capacitors, and here's our labor costs and the screws and our subcontractors and where things are coming from. If ever they sort of start to get a little dicey and hiding stuff, that's always a big red flag that there could be an issue down the road in terms of negotiating or managing things. And so I always make sure that when working with a factory, we can have an open BOM and a clear understanding of things. So some things that you might want to make sure that you discuss when negotiating a partnership to avoid unpleasant surprises down the road is you want to understand how excess is handled. This is a question of a lot of people at the early stages of making are really excited. We're going to go make 10,000 units and we're going to sell it to the world, and that's awesome. But then there's this thing that happens when you stop making, right? And there's this pipeline that's still kind of full, or even more simple stuff like if you're going to go ahead and build 1,000 of something, and the minimum order quantity because parts come in a reel is 3,000, what happens to those other 2,000 parts, right? So you'll get these quotations from factories, and the price looks really awesome, and then you'll run the stuff, and at the end of the day, you'll end up with this bill that was actually just as much as the product itself, and they say, what's this bill for? Well, that's the parts we didn't use in building your 1,000 pieces, because we had to buy 2,000 or 3,000 of the parts ahead. And then you end up in this very unpleasant situation where you're like, well, do I now burn the relationship with the factory and stick them with the goods and start over again with a new one? Or do I pay them? Or how do we deal with this sort of stuff? So it's also important to sort of make sure you get that sort of elephant in the room out there and talk about it, because it can be a difficult conversation to have at times. Another understand what's included in the factory's margin. When factories kind of quote you stuff and you're looking at one from the other, some of them actually throw a lot of stuff into the margin line. They'll throw a lot of the setup costs and the non-recurring engineering, a lot of the engineering costs inside of that piece. I've had factories who essentially, if I were to get a tooling engineer in the US to help me with my industrial design and review things, you could pay 6 figures for that service as a consulting. And then there's factories in China who will just throw that in as part of the deal. You buy the tool with them, and you get a top-notch tooling engineer, and they'll review your stuff, and they'll give you recommendations. And that in itself, right, kind of just falls in that margin line for them, but it's an invaluable service. So it's important to sort of get a concept as to what's actually included in that margin line, what are their capabilities that are not explicitly put out there. Another thing is that small runs are possible with a good relationship and a little bit of extra money. Right? I don't manufacture these days in 10,000 quantity or 100,000 quantity anymore. I mean, I'm too small. My runs vary from to 1,000 a good day. And I'm still building these things in China. I'm still working with factories and facilities in China to get this done. And I find it actually very cost effective and very easy to do, but it really hinges upon having a great relationship with a factory and someone who understands you and believes that you're going to do good things. And it's always good to have a plan for how to handle the worst case scenario. Worst case scenarios such as like, what happens if we ship it and like a ton of product comes back? What if the yield fallout's like 20%? What are these kinds of things? Having these kinds of conversations up front and laying these plans out is a good thing. It also helps to get like insurance, for example. Product insurance is something I recommend everyone should get who's going to launch something out there. Errors, emissions, and all these kinds of things. A little bit of insurance goes a long way to sort of help a lot of unforeseen consequences. So you know that a partnership is healthy when you can have frank and open conversations about problems with both sides, as I've sort of understood here. I mean, one of the really important tests is that when something actually does go wrong in your line, what is the first email that comes across? Is it, how do we fix it? Are you talking to the engineers and they're reporting you and says, honestly, we've got a problem, they're scratching on the tool, or we got a bunch of components and all the leads are bent, right? And then, the ammo is not like, well, you're going to have to pay for these and buy it again, but rather the first question from both sides is, how do we fix it? How do we prevent it from happening again? How do you keep that moving forward? If that's the first response and the guys on the line are trained to do that, then that's a good sign. And actually, that's a cultural value that actually is part of a factory's values that goes all the way down. Some factories are very, very strict about their employees, and any sort of faults they may have to take out of the salary, they may lose their job. They're very, that's the way the boss runs the company. And you'll find that those employees will tend to hide things from you and push blame more often. But if you have a boss of the factory who believes more about sort of employee growth and that people in the staff are important and they want actually to build relationships, the boss himself will encourage them to actually point out the problems and go to the customer and talk to you and tell these kinds of things. And you can really feel that that kind of difference depending on what the boss says and how the factory should be run when it comes to problems. It's healthy when decisions are based on what's best for business and not ego. I may have a PhD from MIT, but I love it when a factory owner totally owns me. Or just a line worker, just like some guy on the line is like, that doesn't go there. And I go, oh, you're right. And that's great, right? You don't sit there and say, well, obviously you don't know how these designs work. How can you possibly know all you do is solder? These guys sit there all day long building this stuff. They really know how it goes together. And so you're not making decisions based upon your ego. And likewise, the factory guys are not telling you, well, I've built, 1 million of these remote controls, so I know exactly how it's going to work. No one's going to buy a remote control with that kind of finish. And you say, well, actually, that's why it's going to be different, right? And then hopefully, each side can get past their ego and understand that there can be value coming from anywhere. And really, most importantly, I think it's important that both sides feel they're more capable as a result of working together. As sort of a small player, and a lot of times in Chumby, our volume was still very small compared to the really big players. One of the biggest cards I always had to play with a factory was that if I walk into the factory, I will make your factory better. I will work with your engineers. I will train them. I will teach them. I will explain to them why things are going wrong. I will transfer technology into them. We will help them learn how to build better test jigs. We'll improve their processes. And when the boss realizes that you're actually not just there as a customer, but you're actually there as sort of a person from the outside who can actually transfer technology in the factory and leave something of lasting value inside their service organization, then a lot of small orders are not a problem because they see it as a much greater context for more business. So that's my kind of little a part of the presentation. I guess I'll hand it over to John now. So, go ahead. I want to give. Yeah.